What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking melodic death metal bands. Alright, very happy to revisit one of my favorite subgenres, and let's just start with the big four, or in this case, it's kind of more of a big five. You can let me know down in the comments. Like, to me, the melodic death metal big four is Dark Tranquillity, At the Gates, In Flames, and then Arch Enemy and Soilwork kind of battle it out. So who do you feel like belongs in that fourth spot? But yeah, we'll kick it off with Dark Tranquillity, and it should be no surprise, given my attire today, how I feel about this band. Absolutely love this band. It was a joy to see them live. I own every single album, and I don't think that they really truly have a bad one. Like the first album, Skydancer, I don't even fully count it because it wasn't the full lineup at that point. Their sound hadn't been solidified, but from the gallery on, it's just magical. Just magical. I love every single album, or at least something about it. There's something special about each one. Some are better than others, definitely, but as regular viewers know, and what, if you're new here, you should know, is that I put a lot of weight on the quality of the overall discography in terms of how I rank these things. So given that they are forerunners and also have just a immaculate discography, with even their like quote unquote worst albums, I would say are better than a lot of like really good albums that come out today. So Dark Tranquillity, S tier, easily. Now some people look at a big four and they say, okay, well then big four is all S tier, right? Again, I disagree. I think discography has a lot to do with it. Big four really just means like how influential are they? Like, are they the big ones that kind of started the genre and that everybody sort of marks as influences moving forwards from there? So next one's At the Gates. Really enjoy At the Gates, but I don't think that they're S tier. I really don't. Like, Slaughter of the Soul is an S tier album. There's no question about that. And then I've enjoyed some of their later stuff too. Like, I know reactions were really mixed on the most recent album, but I love that they finally kind of like took a left turn, went into all those like traditional prog rock influences and mixed it in with their usual sound. I thought that was much more interesting than To Drink the Night itself, which I think is kind of a dull, bland album that some people really enjoy, but I just think it's just sort of meh. At War with Reality, pretty solid. If you check out, I did a full discography tier list ranking on my At the Gates albums. You can hear my thoughts on all of them. And then like their pre-Slaughter of the Soul albums are decent, but not great. So I think their status still elevates them pretty high. I don't think they have like a terrible album, but ultimately I think A tier feels more appropriate for them. All right, next up we have In Flames. Now, In Flames is always hard to rank because their earlier stuff, really great, really important to the Gothenburg scene in particular, but just melodic death metal in general. A lot of people still cite these guys as influences, but if we're again looking at the whole breadth of their discography, we got some issues to the point where now I'd say they have as many bad albums or not so great albums as really classic albums. So yeah, me personally, most of the bands in here, I've done full tier lists on their discography, so you can hear my thoughts on all of them. But just shorthand, I love Horacle and Colony. I also like some of their later stuff. I have some nostalgia for Soundtrack for Your Escape and Reroute to Remain, which some people absolutely hate. There's a lot of varied opinions on this discography, but basically everything after Come Clarity, save for like one or two albums, I can just completely do without. Like, you could toss them in the trash. So I can't rank them in the upper echelon. Like, part of me feels like they should be up there because of their legacy, but I feel like they've really tarnished their legacy too. So I'm not going to put them all the way at the bottom because they have those extra legacy points, but I still think in like B-. And you'll notice too, I changed this list so that it is B+, B-, and C is what it should be. Forgot to fix that. Oops. Yeah, there's no like D tier bands in here, I would say. And even the C tier bands are still like worth listening to. Everything in here has some quality to it. All right, as for Soilwork, I've got kind of similar feelings about it. I don't think have as many like straight up just kind of garbage albums as In Flames, but they've definitely got kind of an inconsistent discography. From the earlier stuff, I love the Chain Heart Machine. I think that's a fantastic Forerunner album. And then moving into their more kind of like popular around the 2000s stuff. I enjoy Natural Born Chaos and even Figure Number 5 to an extent, even though that's not a great album, but there are some songs on there that I remember just like jamming to on road trips and stuff, so I've got some nostalgia for those. And then here and there some solid stuff. I am though like wondering if they're going to be on like an upturn, which some of these bands get, because that latest EP that they did in 2020, if I'm remembering right, all the years meshed together right now, y'all. But that progressive turn they took, I think that's some of the best music they've ever written. And that whole EP is fantastic. So I'm rooting for Soilwork to really step it up. But I do think that Bjorn can be a little over the top, to say the least, sometimes. And the songwriting can get lost in the midst of that. So also B- for them, but I'd actually kind of put them a little bit higher than In Flames. Arch Enemy too, like another very inconsistent discography in my opinion, but there are different albums from the eras that I really enjoy. From the really early stuff, Burning Bridges, another great one I love alongside like the Chain Heart Machine era for Soilwork. And then moving into the Angela Gossow era, Wages of Sin is an absolute classic. Love that album. Spent a lot of time with it. And then Anthems of Rebellion's pretty decent too. Good follow-up to that. Then they kind of lose me quite a bit there. And honestly, of the more recent era, I've not been so impressed. I've liked songs here and there. I haven't hated most of what I've heard. Again, though, I will tell you, like, I'm always rooting for a band to improve. And the latest single that they dropped at the time that I recorded this anyways, is more of like a straight up power metal single, like symphonic metal, power metal kind of style. And I think that just suits Alyssa's vocal style and range better. And I think it was one of the best songs I've heard from them in a very long time. So I'm very interested to hear that album, and it's just good to hear legacy acts switching things up. But as it stands right now, I'm actually going to put Arch Enemy in C tier. All right, moving on from that, we've got The Haunted, which is a tough one, another tough one for me, because I love The Haunted Made Me Do It and One Kill Wonder. I think those two albums are unmissable. If you have not listened to those albums, you absolutely need to. And their debut's pretty solid too, but those two in particular, absolutely fantastic. Everything else kind of like C tier realm, not fantastic stuff. So it's like you've got these two really, in my mind, monumental albums, and then the rest is just sort of Nothing bad, nothing terrible, but what I do like about these guys is they kind of continued on with that At the Gates flair, with kind of like a thrashy energy mixed in with the Melodeath influences, lots of faster songs, always fun for that. So I can't rank them high. I love those albums. I would rank those as even like S tier albums, but again, as far as the band goes, I think I'm going to go to a B-. And I kind of have to put them lower than In Flames, because In Flames has more really solid albums than The Haunted do. All right, Amorphis. This is one of the newer discography tier lists that I've done recently. I did a deep dive on everything that they've done, and they're an interesting one because they're not exclusively a melodic death metal band, right? They've got some albums that are just straight up like progressive rock, even like alternative rock at times. They've got albums that just really run the gamut in terms of stylistically what they're trying to do. Mixed bag, I would say. I like their like really super early stuff is more just kind of traditional melodic death metal. I don't really like the alternative section of their discography. Kind of like is okay in some areas and then just downright bad in others. So it really takes a dip. But their latest albums, like the last, I want to say 4 or 5 even, have been very strong. Right up to Halo is a good album that continues to grow on me too. Under the Red Cloud and Circle really stand out. Also Skyforger. Really just like broadening their, if you want atmosphere, this is the band to go to, especially their later albums. So I'm really stoked in kind of where they're at. It seems like they went through kind of an identity crisis for a while throughout their career, and I think they've finally figured out like where their sweet spot is, but are still experimenting with it too, which is great. So I'm going to put these guys at B+. All right, some new ones that were not included when I did this last time. We got Omnium Gatherum, which Chris definitely recommended, and a couple people in the comments did. Chris Dahlberg writes for the written angle of the metaltrenches.com website. You can check out even more of his reviews. He covers a lot of underground stuff, more black metal than I do too. But anyways, he's definitely a proponent of these guys. And I went in and listened to the discography, and we were having a conversation about how a lot of these bands in this genre hit their stride pretty quickly within the first, first or second album. Sometimes the third. But Omnium Gatherum kind of stumbled for a while. Like, their first two albums, the riffing is pretty darn solid. Like, it's pretty enjoyable. But the vocals are kind of weak. And those two albums are pretty similar. So it's like, they end up being okay, but it's like, okay, I'd rather listen to, an album from one of my more favorite bands that does this even better. And then on the third album, the vocals get even worse. They go through a switch there, and I even compared them to like Chris Barnes level. Like, there's no E, but it's still pretty bad. And like, the riffs start to get better, the production gets better, they add more synth elements and atmosphere, they start adding some singing. Around the fourth album, that starts to improve, and then I feel like it wasn't until like the fifth album where they actually start to sound like the band that they are today. Like, more focus on that kind of moody, melancholic sound, vocals also dipping into more of like a doomy growl, which Chris compared to Swallow the Sun, which I think is pretty apt. I would also potentially compare it to Bellacore at times, which we'll get to. And then the music, as far as like the guitars, kind of more in line with Insomnium at that point. So that's when they kind of hit their stride. And then even further down is where things like really start to sound good. And I liked their latest album too. But like, that's the element of the sound I like the most. So again, if we're looking at the breadth of their discography and kind of the stumbling points they went through, it's hard for me to rank them higher. And it was kind of a chore to get through those first couple of albums. So I'm actually still going to put them at C tier, but I think they have room to improve. And also, I haven't listened to their discography as much as some of these others, so my opinion of them may grow. Another new addition is Nightrage, which have been around since the 2000s too, but kind of flew under the radar, somewhat like Omnium Gatherum. And I told Chris, I'm like, damn, I'm glad you recommended me these guys, because I wish I had learned about them sooner. They kick things off really strong right from the beginning with Sweet Vengeance. Like, very aggressive sound that's very obviously inspired by that Slaughter of the Soul kind of dynamic. And speaking of dynamics, like, really good, kind of combining both the thrashy, faster stuff and then the more mid-paced, kind of melodically focused ones. Very earworm too, with some In Flames influences as well. The clean singing can be a little yarly and corny at times, like on Circle of Pain, but it's pretty infrequent. So good stuff. So starting off really strong and then stayed consistent throughout the whole discography. Like, I was like, holy crap. Like, there is not a bad album here. There's parts where like the production gets a little bit weaker here and there, but the singing then improves. There's parts where they sound a little bit more metalcore, which is okay for me because I like metalcore, but may not be what some people want. And then they kind of move more into the direction of what Soilwork did with, again, like Natural Born Chaos, that kind of song. And then coming full circle, there's even a guest spot on the fifth album from Thomas Lindberg himself of At the Gates, which was really cool. So I was really stoked on this band. I'm really looking forward to spending a lot more time with them. And ultimately, I put them pretty high. I'm not ready to put them in the top 2 tiers, but I'd put them in B+. Really solid stuff that if you haven't checked out, you definitely should. All right, another newer addition here. We got Scar Symmetry. Pretty solid mix of harsh and clean vocals. Almost more of a 50-50 on this one, so good mix. Almost a little like Opeth sound too, and like how deep the growls are and then how soft and soothing the cleans are. The riffs are a little bit, again, kind of Soilworky, again, that sort of Natural Born Chaos kind of sound. Lots of great groove, effective use of like start-stops in the riffing too. Quite a bit of synth. Very strong debut for these guys as well, and then they get more atmospheric from there, kind of getting more like melodramatic on later albums, which leads to some really neat moments, but also some inconsistent songwriting. And then even on their most recent stuff, they've been getting a lot more progressive with like really incredible guitar work. Like a far cry. If you listen to the earlier stuff and then you get to that, you're like, holy cow, like they're going full on like neoclassical shredding, just amazing stuff. So another band I'm looking forward to spend more time with, and it's good, But I'd say comparatively to some of the other bands we're going to get to on this list, it's not something I enjoy listening to front to back as much as them. It also can get a little bit long-winded. The singing can get a little too corny, just like Bjorn can in places, to be honest. So I think they fit like kind of near their peers. They're not quite as high because there's a lot of similarities. If you like Soilwork a lot more than I do, you'd probably also rank these guys higher. But me personally, I'm going to put them at C tier, but I am looking forward to hearing more from them. And then I think the last new addition that I didn't cover last time is Hypocrisy. Now, these guys have a really long discography, especially, like, this was the deepest dive of the bands that I just hadn't paid as much attention to over the years for no particular reason. And they start off as just more of a traditional death metal band, more like old school death metal. Then they start to move into some, like, death doomy stuff mixed in on the Fourth Dimension. And they don't actually go full on, like, melodeath until Abducted, and then really the final chapter brings in some straight up at the gate sounding moments, which makes sense since that album came out just 2 years after Slaughter of the Soul. It seemed like at that point too they clearly wanted to do almost like a reset, so they did a self-titled album as their 6th album, like moving into the new millennium. And at that point I feel like that's where all the elements are better implemented, but I'd also argue that it sounds kind of like almost a carbon copy of some of my favorite albums that already existed by then. And even parts of Catch-22 sound as if they're trying to sort of unsuccessfully jump on the Meshuggah train. I think they truly come into their own around the Arrival, but even then it's kind of more of like a sci-fi version of In Flames as I describe it. So inconsistent discography with some high points, but none really high enough that I was ever really floored to anything I was listening to. Like, I enjoyed it, and especially when I got to the later stuff, I was enjoying it more and more, but I never had that moment like I did with Nightrage where I was like, oh wow, like, I want to spend more time with this. Albums can also be a little bit bloated and inconsistent within themselves. I guess Virus was pretty solid. I think that was one that, if one did sort of stand out to me, that was the one. I think I'm going to put these guys, though, at C tier, and I think that's going to be maybe the first one that people in the comments get really mad about. Maybe you're already mad, but as always, I welcome disagreement. This is just my completely subjective opinion. Music is art, and art is subjective. So that's what's fun about it, is we all get to share our differing opinions and have a conversation about it. All right, let's jump back into some more classics here. So, Amon Amarth. Now, these are one of the bands on this list that kind of stand out a little bit because their sound is a little bit different. Like, they're still holding on to some of those Swedish tropes, but then they've got their whole other thing going where they're also doing this Viking thing with all the Norse mythology. And I gotta tell you, I love that shit. Like, that is just so fun to me. Like, it's nerdy, and it doesn't take itself overly seriously, and it's just fun. And I love fun. And pretty consistent discography. Like, right from the beginning, One Cent from the Golden Hall, really strong, really aggressive. And then as you move through their discography, they get to these more kind of mid-paced anthems with more like shake your fist in the air, sing-along kind of moments. And then like really coming into their own with some really solid guitar hooks. The only problem is, of late, they've been kind of pissing me off. Like, I did not like Jomsviking. I think that was the first like real misstep for me. I know some people even earlier than that started having problems, but that was the turn for me. I found Jomsviking to be incredibly boring, and I've tried to revisit it over and over again, hoping that maybe my opinion will change, because I know some people love that album, but I just don't care for it. I really don't. And then Berserker, I think, is even worse. Like, I think that is just like a straight up, I rarely say bad album, but I do think it's kind of a bad album. I'm just not really into it. So it's hard. It's that recency effect where even though they have a really strong discography beforehand, once they start falling off and then they continue to fall off, and that's the most recent stuff in the years that have just passed to consider, that's tough. So overall, though, they have way more home runs than they do have negative ones. And I hope that they can right the ship, no pun intended. But they can ultimately do whatever they want. I'm just some fucking idiot on the internet wearing a rubber Halloween mask. So for me, I'm going to put them at A tier. All right, Children of Bodom. This is another one that may upset people, may garner some mixed reactions at least. So first of all, some people even argue whether they even belong on this list. Are they melodic death metal? I say that they are. They're kind of like melodic death metal's answer to power metal, or even I've called them like a melodic death, like hair metal band. That's what their energy reminds me of the most. But a very inconsistent discography, and I've seen from, like, I like to check the, like, Metal Storm lists when I'm doing this, not necessarily Metal Archives, because that's a little different, but I like to see how fans vote on the albums in addition to just how I feel about them. And yeah, I'd say out of almost all of these, this band has the most, like, really low in the red scores. And then also some really high ones too. So personally, I enjoy Hatebreeder and Follow the Reaper, but my personal favorites are Hate Crew Death Roll and actually Ain't It Dead Yet, which I know some people really don't like, but I'd argue is their most, like, straight melodeath album, and I think it's, like, really consistent. It's just really fun and anthemic. And then after that, I kind of like certain songs, but not many albums. I definitely wouldn't put these guys at the bottom because I think they're very influential. I loved their energy, and the guitar work and synth work too is, like, absolutely unmatched by comparison. So they get some extra points for that. And then, of course, rest in peace, Alexei. Like, was just a force in the scene that will be greatly missed. So I'm not going to put them at C. I'm going to put them at B-. And I didn't even say, here's another rule for this tier list that I probably should have laid out from the beginning. 4 per tier. That's all you get. Like, that, I really like to restrict myself to those types of parameters because it makes it more interesting and it makes me, like, really challenge myself to actually think through this. All right, next up, we have a personal favorite of mine, Moore's Principium Est. And some people are still like, who? But this is a Finnish band that has been around for a pretty long time, but just never, like, hit it big, but have consistently just been dropping banger after banger. Like, Liberation Equals Termination is one of my favorites. This is another band too that, like, really amplifies the synth element in a number of different styles. Some are a little bit more electronic, others it's more symphonic. And speaking of which, their latest album, 7, it's just a joy. Like, it's super symphonic. I think the best they've sounded in terms of their production, although I've heard some people say it's their worst. So there seems to be a broad variety of opinions on this, but they're so good. Like, the hooks, the guitar work is fantastic. I think their weakest area has always been the vocals, but they've never been bad, and they've been serviceable to the rest of the music. So another band that, if you somehow still have slept on these guys, you absolutely need to check them out. As the album name implies, at the time of recording, there are 7 albums. They're putting out a new one, but as far as I can tell, it's like a compilation of re-recorded versions from their first 3 albums, I believe, including The Unborn, which is another fantastic album that you definitely need to check out. I'm going to put these guys at A tier. I almost put them at S tier because they're just so dang consistent, but they don't quite have the, like, impact of some of the other bands I'm going to put even higher. But I would actually put them above At the Gates. I think that album for album, they're just stronger. All right, speaking, though, of bands that do it even better, Carcass. Now, Carcass is special here because not only do they have a benchmark melodic death metal album that has to be mentioned anytime you do a history of melodic death metal albums in Heartwork, but then from there on, like, you've also got their newer stuff in Surgical Steel, which was very well received and I very much enjoy. And then I also enjoyed their latest one too that, again, had some kind of mixed reactions, but it was one of my favorite albums of 2021, where they mixed together the progressive side of their sound, the grindier side of their sound, the melodic death metal, all of that coming together. And that brings me to my bigger point in that Carcass can do it all. Like, they started out with Reek of Putrefaction, which I don't really care for, but it's just a straight up grimy grindcore album that's very influential in its own right. And then, like I said, with Swan Song, they're doing like a death and roll thing to mixed reactions, but I kind of enjoy aspects of it all. And I just appreciate a band that has that much diversity and that much ability to do all sorts of different things. And so for that reason, they have the rare status of being the only band on this list that makes S tier for melodic death metal, but also made S tier for my, like, classic death metal band list that you can also check out if you have not already. All right, coming into another kind of, like, smaller, more recent band that's been just growing in popularity, we've got Australia's Bellacore, which are excellent. Like, I would mention these guys kind of in the same sentence as Moore's Principium Est. I think they're kind of on a similar level. These guys going more for that progressive spin on their sound, and short discography, but pretty darn consistent, like really darn consistent. You've got Stone's Reach, which is their debut, which some people really love, but honestly, for me, I love even more A Breath and Bone is fantastic. Vessels was just phenomenal, and another one that was critically very well received. And then their latest album was decent, but I felt like it kind of fell on the lower end of their discography. That was a little bit disappointing for me, but still good. Like that album, even though it wasn't their best, it was still stronger than a lot of stuff in the genre from that year. So I'm ultimately going to put these guys at B+, another band that you need to check out if you have not. Kalmah, a band that I am actively trying to spend a lot more time with and just continue to be impressed by every time I revisit them. What I love about Kalmah too is, again, I'm a sucker for the synth, and these guys really know how to throw some earworm and atmospheric synth into their sound. And then the other element I love is that I'm a big folk metal fan, and these guys always bring this kind of folky swing to their music that is just so much fun and so entertaining, and it's across albums, and they're another one that I just, like, I don't think they have a bad one. Like, I really don't. They start off right from the get-go with their debut, which is fantastic in its own right, and then they just, like, kept stringing along the hits all the way up to Palo, which I also really enjoyed. So I can't remember where I ranked them the first time I did this, but I went ahead and I popped them up to S tier. Like, I feel like they deserve it, and what else can I say? I'm looking forward to spending a lot more time with Kalmah. All right, regulars on the channel know I always like to slip in a little bit more of like an underground treat to kind of expose people to something different, because that's a big like purpose of this channel, is to get people to step outside of their comfort zone, try something new. And so we've got Serenity in Murder. This is a Japanese melodic death metal band that is just stellar, fantastic, especially their last two albums. They are great. The problem is they're really hard to get a hold of because their distribution sucks. Like, unless you're in Japan, it's really hard to get a hold of their stuff unless you want to pay exorbitant shipping rates, especially right now with the way things are. So you can see some of their stuff on like YouTube, which is where I'd recommend like just like getting started. But man, if you love Dark Tranquillity in particular, like I feel like they take a lot of influence from that sound, but then kind of like do their own special thing with it. They went through a vocalist change too on the last album, and they just did not miss a beat. Like I think that those last two again are just incredible. Really excited to see these guys hopefully like get more global recognition, and I'm trying to be like a proponent of that. But ultimately, like, until they get a better like PR team and maybe even a bigger label, I don't know if that's what they want to do. That's going to be harder, but you got to check out Serenity and Murder. I'm going to put them at B+. All right, the Black Dahlia Murder, another band that kind of like stands out. Sort of one of these things is not like the others on this list, in that they're a much more like Americanized version of the sound. They have far more influence than just melodic death metal, but they do their own thing with it, and they've just made it work. And there are so many bands just like trying to ape their sound, but there are just none quite like the Black Dahlia Murder, in my opinion, and I love what they do. I really do. It's enjoyable. Another band where I love pretty much every album. There are some albums that are not as good as others, but there is no album in their discography where I'm like, I will not listen to it because I think it's bad. It just doesn't exist. Like even ones like Abysmal, which repeatedly gets sent lower down on the scale when fans talk about their albums, I can still enjoy that album. So the only thing that holds them back a little bit is that every album is basically the same album. And so there's not a lot of variety to be found. I don't mind that though, because they do it so well that it never bores me. Like it's always entertaining. It's always fun. I would be a little bit interested to see them step a little bit more outside the box, but ultimately I think I originally had them at S tier, but I'm going to move them down a little bit to A tier, and pretty high at that. Like I'm a huge The Black Dahlia Murder fan. In fact, I'm sporting their patch on here. Yep, there it is right there. And then we have Insomnium, which was probably the biggest point of contention of my previous tier list, because I think I described them using words like boring, complained a little bit about some of their slower, more melodic stuff, but I will contest, like, I can admit when I'm wrong, and I've been spending a lot more time with these guys, especially since I've been listening to their newer stuff too. I will continue to say that I think Winter's Gate is still the best thing that they've done. Like, I love that they did just, and sometimes I hate that where a band tries to do like a big progressive, like one piece for the whole album, but I love how they broke it up and it's just consistently engaging. And that's not an easy thing to pull off. So I was very impressed with that. Shadows of the Dying Sun, you know, it's got some really great bangers on there that are absolute classics that I love having in my playlist. And then their latest EP too, showing their more like softer, folkier, kind of just blissful side with not a lot of the like really aggressive and distorted stuff. Like it's almost a straight up like acoustic EP, but not quite. And I've since gone back and started re-listening to their catalog again, and at some points I did straight up be like, what was wrong with me? Like this is really good. They start off really strong and continue to do so, and like I said, I'm going to continue to spend more time with these because it's one of my favorite subgenres and I just can't get enough of it. And you don't get enough of it now either. Like this genre is not as much in vogue as it was in like the 2000s. So long story short, cutting to the chase, you might have figured it out already since it's the only spot left, but I am moving up Insomnium, rightly so, to S tier. But y'all let me know, how would you rank these albums down in the comments? Where do we agree? Where do you disagree? Check out this playlist for a whole lot more metal tier lists, or click here for something a little bit different. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.